King NACIEN of HANGVUIT province. The sun rose sharply over the rocky desert mountain range and the HANGVUIT province. HANGVUIT was a modest kingdom whose southwest tip touched the edge of the black wildwood's northern corner. HANGVUIT was 20 miles northeast of NACIEN and was once part of the Geirwolf Empire. The province seceded a decade after Emperor Geirwolf's untimely death. In many ways it was a sister empire to NACIEN, but not nearly as elegant or lavish. The House of HANGVUIT was a palatial fortress built in a niche between a barren mountain range and a desert oasis. The ruler of the HANGVUIT, King NACIEN, lived in a modest acropolis carved into the mountain. A 20-foot-tall rock wall protected the perimeter of the House of HANGVUIT, and at each corner stood guard posts where white flags with images of lions flapped in the breeze. King NACIEN was resting in the Lord's quarters in the House of HANGVUIT. Time had not been good to him, and although he was only 35 years old, he looked closer to 50. NACIEN was a humble man, with modest tastes to suit his modest kingdom. His beard was full and grey, and he hadn't kept off the extra weight that comes with age. The corners of his eyes were like crow's feet, and even his eyebrows were grey to match a thin moustache and long ponytail. Basically, every part of NACIEN's body had been ravaged by age, worry, and sacrifice. NACIEN's hands were the exception. He had the hands of a man half his age. They were massive, and his fingers were thick and muscular. The Lord's quarters were NACIEN's personal suite. He shared the room only with this wife and queen until she died of a sudden illness 3 years ago. Now NACIEN shared the room with his 4-year-old son, Tanner, who slept in the same spot on the bed as his mother. NACIEN often wondered if the boy sensed the presence of his mother, because he was certain Tanner had no recollection of his missing parent. He never mentioned it. NACIEN stared out the window. In the distance he could see the edge of the black wildwood. Behind that edge was 20 miles of forest, then 10 miles of mountain range. Behind the mountain range was a beautiful meadow, then more miles of forests, and finally the province of NACIEN's foreheart. NACIEN returned to the bed and gently kissed Tanner's forehead. Tanner had wrapped himself like a cocoon in a woven blanket trimmed with the skin of a bear. There was a knock at the door, and NACIEN grunted in a manner that signaled Zan, who stood outside. He pushed the door open and rushed in. Zan was a commoner who fought and worked his way up to being a land baron. Later, he became the trusted confidant of King NACIEN. When the war with King Kalin started, Zan proved to be a sturdy warrior. NACIEN waited for Zan to gather himself. He was always so exasperated by events. King NACIEN had learned to be patient and wait. This often frustrated Zan, who often preferred to take quick, decisive action. "My apologies for disturbing you at such an early hour, my lord." Zan apologized. "I thought it important to tell you that our confidant confirmed Empress Shayla was indeed lost in the Black Wildwood. Your vision was correct." "And?" NACIEN demanded. "Was she found?" Zan hung his head. "Yes." A flash of relief wiped across NACIEN's expression, then downgraded to dread as he studied Zan's uneasy gaze. NACIEN narrowed his eyes and moved closer. "This is good news, Zan," he stated emphatically. "Why are you uneasy?" Zan tried to disguise his angst. "If spies are discovered, Kalin will twist the matter and blame you for Empress Shayla's disappearance." NACIEN guffawed. "I am sure he has done so already, but that is not all that upsets you." "True, my lord, but I have no mind for fairy tales." Zan was trying to dismiss the conversation before it started, but the worry in his heart was obvious. "Zan, Do not sieve the message for me, NACIEN demanded softly. Tell me, what did Loaiza say? Zan walked to the window to look out at the black wildwood. Whatever he had to say, it involved this mysterious forest out in the distance, and he was trying to come to terms with it. He signed and let his broad shoulders slouch just a bit. She said something curious. She said Empress Shayla had life inside of her. NACIEN suddenly marched across the room, grabbed Zan by the shoulders, and looked squarely in the eyes. Zan looked back and clearly saw the desperation in NACIEN's expression. She was chosen, NACIEN demanded. Is that what Loaiza says? Does she bear the love gift from the spirit of the black wildwood? The child is the promise. He will be an amazing child. Zan shook his head to stop NACIEN's conjecturing. No, my lord, he said glumly. Kaelin replaced the child with another. We have heard nothing more from Loaiza. It is entirely possible that the child is dead, murdered at the hands of Kaelin. NACIEN didn't want to believe it. No, no, no. He marched off, disgusted. Zan took NACIEN's arm to stop him. NACIEN did not stand on the royal traditions of formality or ceremony. It was not uncommon for him to throw his arms around one of his guards while guffawing, nor was it uncommon for a servant to hug NACIEN when he fell into depression after the death of his wife, Thao. Zan knew he had to bring his king down from the ridiculous notions floating in his head. He had to appeal to his tactile sense of logic. And so Zan grabbed NACIEN's arm firmly. NACIEN stopped and turned back to face him. Kaelin knows of the legends. It is likely that the child is dead. Loaiza has sworn not to speak on the matter any more. For her own safety, and because her duty is to Empress Shayla, no one else, sire. NACIEN slumped into his chair. His spirit was deflated, and his strength sapped by the dismal news. Yes, it is likely that if Kaelin replaced the child is no more. Slain. Gods, are we so corrupt that even our blessings are as unpalatable as bitter fruit? NACIEN limped back to the bed. He suddenly felt very old and achy. He sat at the edge of the bed where Tana lay, curled in the fetal position, blankets thrown astray. If only your mother were here to provide you with the nurturing a boy so richly deserves, NACIEN whispered to Tana. He ran his strong fingers through the boy's hair. And now I have a promise to keep. NACIEN turned to Zan with dread in his eyes. Our last hope for peace has been dashed like a flame in a monsoon. Send our fastest scouts to locate and remove our confidants from HANGVUIT province, if they so desire. It is no longer safe. Zan nodded, spun on his heels and raced through the door. Time was of the essence now. Servants, experienced horticulturists and landscapers, meticulously maintained the imperial gardens of NACIEN Castle. The garden was lavish, with rolling hills and grassy footpaths. Fruit trees and grapevines were woven into the landscape, creating enclaves and retreats for anyone seeking solitude. The gardens were meant to be a retreat for the king, but were seldom used by him. As Shayla grew older, she had the garden caretakers replace many of the plants and flowers in favor of softer scents and vivid colors. Shayla also wanted the fresh scent of jasmine, mint, and honeysuckle in the air as she walked the gardens with the servants assigned to her. As for servants, as a child she'd heard gossip of triplets born to a poor woman in a nearby village. Such an occurrence was a blessing, but to someone other than a queen, caring for 3 babies at once was an immense struggle. As an adult, Shayla visited the village months before she was lost in the black wildwood. She offered to allow the children to be trained as her attendants. The mother agreed, and the 3 girls began their instruction. Now, with 2 babies, Shayla knew how convenient it was to have met and bonded with the triplets. She could hardly wait for their training to be completed. A walk in the gardens had been a daily ritual for Shayla and her staff, but one that had eluded her for 6 months as her body slowly recovered from the painfully rapid transformation it underwent to produce a full-term newborn in less than a day. On this day, Loaiza securely held Shayla as they walked the garden together. Loaiza, a small woman in her 70s, looked frailer than Shayla as they inched their way along the winding path, listened to the birds sing and chuckled at each other with childlike silliness. Still, Loaiza held her queen tightly and would gladly cast herself to the stone floor to mitigate a fall if Shayla lost her balance. Loaiza felt that her life was dedicated to Shayla, and now that her queen had given birth, the rest of Loaiza's life would be committed to royal servitude. Loaiza helped Shayla ascend a small cobblestone knoll to a stone bench under a cherry blossom tree. "Your recovery has been extraordinary, my lady," Loaiza said matter-of-factly. Few things surprised Loaiza. She'd seen the remarkable things Emperor Gerwolf had done once he became one with the black wildwood, and heard it call out to him. "Considering a mere 6 months have passed since the miracle, even Ping is surprised by your ability to walk on your own." Shala was distracted by the dazzling charcoal ivy and black lotus plants that dotted the hilltop and were sprinkled like pepper in a rice bowl, in fields of white chrysanthemums. As she stared, the din of high-pitched murmurs began to rise in her head like tinny voices in a crowd. The voices grew louder as she stared at the velvety petals of the black lotus plants and their silver-grey stamen and bright yellow pistil. Black lotus flowers did not exist anywhere but in the black wildwood near the hills and valleys around the Nyansvachachi province. Yet, even in these carefully maintained grounds and the amazingly fertile gardens, black lotus flowers were rare. Yet, here they were, surrounding Shala as billions of stars in the sky surround the earth. The din in her head rose even higher, and Shala touched her temple to ease the throbbing pain in her head. "Are you okay, my lady?" Loaiza asked with concern. Her eyes were narrow as she scrutinized Shayla's reaction to the flowers. "I was considering the miracle, Loaiza," Shayla uttered softly, as if trying to convince herself. "It was a miracle well timed with the blossoms of my favorite flowers. When did the gardeners plant them?" "We did not plant them," Loaiza corrected. "The blossoms sprung up the day after you gave birth." Shayla had to pause a moment to think about this. What was she supposed to think about this? Her favorite flowers sprung up automatically after she gave birth to a child she never believed she would have. Was this, too, a miracle? Shayla eagerly turned to Loaiza. Her face was beaming with joy. The din in her head was rapidly fading away, and her headache was gone. "I am ready to return to my children." Loaiza escorted Shayla out of the gardens, through the flowery path to the castle, and into the inner courtyard. Shayla gazed at the marble columns, which had been neatly polished, probably for her arrival, and she noticed razor-sharp scratches all over the columns. Beside the markings, she also saw an impression in an oak wall. The impression had the shape of a clenched fist, and then Shayla remembered. This is where Kalin trains daily. This is where Kalin became an unbeatable king. He'd earned the nickname, the Warrior King, because he fought in every battle, and even the most fearless warriors in his army wouldn't dare face him on the battlefield. Kalin was fierce and merciless. The room, as elegant and polished as it were, was a reminder to all of Caelin's power and ruthlessness. Caelin left his mark everywhere he went. Loaiza led Shyla to the maid's chamber suite in an area of the castle typically reserved for the king and queen's servants. The suite was just steps away from the queen's bedchamber and served as a home for Loaiza and her daughter, Eowlin. They lived and slept in the quaint area, although they owned a small cottage in a nearby township. Loaiza wanted to be close to the queen in the event she was needed in the middle of the night. Loaiza pushed the door to the maid's chamber open, and Shyla stepped inside. Loaiza followed her in, but immediately stopped in her tracks. In front of them, on the floor, was a sight Shyla was startled to see. Inside the maid's chamber, Eowlin had set a small limestone bathtub on the floor. Baby Damarie and baby Mieko sat in the tub, together, splashing and playing in the soapy, warm water. To anyone else, the sight was innocent and playful. Some might even call it silly and fun, but to a member of the royal family, it might be considered sacrilege for a child of the king to be bathed in the same water with a common child or servant. Eowlin did not expect Shyla to return so quickly. Her walks in the garden often lasted for hours. True, Eowlin hadn't factored in Shyla's body and its need for recuperation and rest. She had hoped to have both children bathed and dressed before Loaiza returned with the queen. But there was more. Unknown to Loaiza or anyone else, Eowlin had bathed the children together many times over the last 6 months. During this time, the 2 baby girls had bonded to each other, almost like twins. They did everything together, and Eowlin worked hard to make sure Damarie spent time with Mieko, although Mieko was a child of privilege, and there are many things Damarie was not entitled to experience. Eowlin never had to worry, because Shyla could not move around the castle without help. Today was different. Today, Shyla had help, and Loaiza had brought her back to the children early. Today, Eowlin was caught. Eowlin quickly wrapped Mieko in a white blanket with a royal crest as Loaiza and Shyla stood gawking. Mieko cooed and tried to reach for Damarie, who remained seated in the tub. Eowlin, Loaiza quizzed. "Why would you do such a thing?" she demanded. "Forgive me, my lady," Eowlin pleaded. Eowlin handed Mieko to Loaiza, rushed to the back, and grabbed a faded black swaddling cloth. She gently lifted Damarie from the tub and covered her with the makeshift blanket. Shyla was speechless and stood looking between the 2 children. Eowlin stood silently as well. She was confused, felt guilty, and knew she had to choose her next words wisely. She had made a grave mistake by bathing a princess with a common child and would have to pay the price. But a strange thing happened. The air became charged with energy, the kind of verve that causes infectious laughter. Then the babies started to chuckle and coo, making obsequious noises together as they gazed upon their beautiful mother, fascinated as if she were a goddess in human form. They locked eyes with Shyla, as if hanging on to the slow, steady rise and fall of her bosom as she took a breath. The babies' cooing sounds raised and lowered in volume, and the babies turned to each other as if they were taking turns speaking. It was a conversation in another language. The energy surrounding the 2 children radiated outward until Shyla smiled at the babies. She couldn't help but chuckle along with them until she noticed a second white blanket folded on the floor. It also had a royal crest. It was clear to her that Eowlin's intentions from the beginning were to bathe the children together, to treat them the same. She did this despite imperial orders and royal culture that demanded Damarie and Mieko be treated very differently. Eowlin had a mind to treat the children as equals. And why, shouldn't she? Shyla expressed out loud. Eowlin was one of the few people in the castle who knew that Dalmori was born of the queen and Mieko was stolen from a servant. Shyla pointedly took Dalmori from Eowlin and dropped the swaddling cloth to the floor. She lovingly draped the baby in the buttery, soft white towel with the royal crest. Eowlin barely managed to stifle an outward gasp as she watched. "Do not fret, Eowlin," Shyla offered calmly. "I see I am not the only one who bears witness to their bond." Loaiza placed Mieko in Shyla's free arm. Eowlin took a deep breath and exhaled away the tension building inside her. "I apologize again, Empress Shyla. I have a weakness for the joy I feel when I bathe them together and witness how the girls delight in each other." Shyla looked Eowlin in the eyes. She was not like other servants. She spoke her mind and often took matters into her own hands, regardless of the consequences. Shyla nodded at her. "I too confess. They rest easier when I bring them both into my bed at night." "Of course," Eowlin added boldly. "The king's attempt at malice has only doubled your blessing." Loaiza stepped forward. "Eowlin, that is quite enough." Eowlin backed away. She'd pushed the limits of what her tongue could get away with. Saying anything more was dangerous, especially if she said something against the king. "Forgive my youthful brashness, my lady," Eowlin added in her defense. Shyla did not respond. She was too preoccupied with the darling babies in her arms that craved her attention. When she had cooed in return and made incoherent baby babble noises, Shyla turned to the young maid and smiled. She leaned forward and kissed Eowlin on the cheek. "Eowlin, I hereby appoint you Imperial Caregiver," Shyla proclaimed. "Make sure my girls do all things together from this day on." Eowlin nodded excitedly, but Shyla leaned in closer and with a grave expression. "But remember," she cautioned, "you cannot do such things in plain view of the king. He has expressly forbidden it." Eowlin nodded again. "I understand, my lady." She couldn't care less about the king. He never came around to see the children. Now that she didn't have to hide her actions with the children from Loaiza or Shyla, she could do so much more with them. Shyla departed with the children in her arms. Loaiza followed after her, then stopped and turned back to Eowlin. She gave a slow wink and a smile before continuing after the queen.